and we're delving in to one of the most exciting topics, which is how are young voters going to change how we vote and ultimately how we govern? How will the country be different based on the very large cohort of younger voters coming? I have a spoiler for all of you. I'm not a millennial, but we have two speakers who are experts in them. So this is kind of fun. Our two guests do a podcast, The Pollsters, and this is going to be a sort of The Pollsters Live. So first, on the right, as they used to say, Kirsten Soltis Anderson has the best one-line biography. Kirsten, let's hear it. Kirsten has the best one-line biography in America, and I'm just going to let you say it.
Oh, Florida woman in D.C.
It kind of says it all. Kirsten wrote the book, The Selfie Vote, where millennials are leading America. And she also hosts Sirius XM's The Trend Line. And her partner in crime, Margie O'Mara, is a principal in the Democratic polling firm GBAO. And Margie told me people want to say GBAO, but you just say GBAO. And Margie is New Jersey and Texas woman in Tacoma Park. And she consults to brands, consults to nonprofits, and to candidates. So let's just start out with a provocative idea that David had backstage. And he was asking, is it possible that we're overstating the youth vote? That in fact, A, a lot of them don't vote, and B, they don't vote monolithically. They're like the country. Kirsten, what did the data say?
So first of all, I want to thank the Comcast NBC Universal folks for sponsoring this before I explain why David's question, why he's totally wrong. Universal Studios was my first job as a Florida woman in D.C., growing up in Orlando, so I feel a certain level of loyalty there. But the idea that young voters don't vote monolithically is correct. So first of all, that's true, but they overwhelmingly these days tend to favor Democratic candidates and on a variety of issues lean more progressive. Now, one thing that I hear a lot is, well, but isn't it the case that young people are always more progressive? Why does that matter? Kids always start off progressive and then they become conservative. So this was something that about 10 years ago, right around the time of the election of Barack Obama and the sort of subsequent him being inaugurated, a lot of young people getting engaged in politics, I, coming from the right, wanted to understand, was all of this youth enthusiasm around Obama, this is just normal, young people always embrace the Democratic candidate, or is this really something unusual? Is this something that is very historically different? And what I found was that there have been plenty of times where the Conservative Party has done better with young voters. Ronald Reagan won young voters by almost 20 points in 1984. Conservative parties around the world sometimes will be doing better with younger voters than with older voters, depending on the way the country's government works. So it's not the case that young voters, they're always progressive and they become conservative. And the real reason why winning young voters matters isn't just about elections today. In the midterm elections, if you combine Gen Z, Gen X, and the millennials together, they collectively cast over 62 million votes. The boomers and up cast 60 million votes. So younger voters are making their political voice heard. And in these last midterms, millennials, 42% of those eligible to vote turned out, which was a huge spike over the relatively sleepy midterm of 2014. So they're turning out to vote. They're turning out to vote in the sorts of elections young voters didn't used to participate in. And what is most important, I think, for Republicans is that long term, these young voters are not likely to just come back to the GOP anytime soon. They're breaking for Democrats by historic 20-plus point margins, which again, prior to the election of Barack Obama was not the norm. It used to be 10 or single digits margins among younger voters. Is that someone who turned 18 on the eve of the presidential election in 2016, based on life expectancy, will be voting until 2076. So winning them when they're young will pay dividends over a lifetime of votes, and that's why they matter.
Yeah, as Democrats, I think we're lucky that not many Republicans listen to the advice Kristen's been giving in the selfie vote. Maybe I should start worrying about selfie vote 2.0. But because there's the issue of vote propensity, the likelihood of voting, as well as vote performance and how young people vote. So in vote propensity, that shift that happened in the midterms was so dramatic with young people. I mean, it was really, really astounding. One of the very first projects that I worked on many, many years ago when I first entered polling was to figure out what predicted the reason someone would vote or not vote. It was a bipartisan type of project to figure out what really drove people. And everyone had all these different hypotheses about how alienated you felt from government and whether or not you felt government spoke to you, different kinds of demographics, and whether you felt, you had a real voice, whether you thought voting mattered. And the single biggest predictor was age. I mean, age has always been a real predictor of vote turnout, and it still is. I don't want to minimize the fact that there is a real difference in turnout between older folks and younger folks. Even in the Democratic primary, it's still going to be a lot of older folks as opposed to younger folks. And part of it is just getting into the habit of voting. Part of it is having skin in the game of the policies. As you get older, you become, less mobile. You've settled down. You in a place, more likely, obviously not necessarily, become a homeowner or have more interaction with government in a way where you see the repercussions more immediately. Maybe you're taking care of an elderly parent, have more interaction with the healthcare system. All those things kind of lead you to kind of figure out a little bit more about how government works and the stakes that we have. But performance is really, in democratic performance among younger people, it doesn't have to be that way. That really is about the policies and about which party and younger people, but also obviously democratic performance is increasing in lots of other groups too, who feels communicated to, who feels heard, who feels listened to, who sees the advertising, if they are watching cable or if they cut the cord, or are they getting ads on Snapchat? And all these things, are they seeing people knock on the door where they live or come to their college campus? So all these things are part of, both the performance and the turnout among young people.
Now, the Pew Research Center is the official arbiter of the generational alphabet. So if you're 39 to 54, you're X. If you're 23 to 38, you're Y. And if you're 22 or younger, you're Z, or something to be named later. Now, today you taped an episode of The Pollsters. Take us behind the scenes. Where did you tape it, and what's one thing that you said?
Oh gosh. Well, so we taped, because we are not in our cozy little studio in DC, we each were in separate hotel rooms recording remotely to our producer back in DC. So it really wasn't all that glamorous.
And sneak peek, what did you talk about?
Sneak peek, some of the topics we covered, Gallup has some fresh polling that tracks attitudes on immigration going back decades, and the percentage of people who think immigration is the top issue facing our country is at record highs. But you're also seeing really high levels of people saying that immigrants are good for this country, they're a net positive, they're good for the economy, et cetera. So it's interesting. It's Republicans who are most likely to sort of be more ambivalent on those questions, and they are finding immigration, they're the most likely to say immigration is a top issue, but at the same time, you're seeing those trend lines towards sort of more of a belief that immigrants are positive for America.
We also talked a little bit about the upcoming debates. Obviously, there's not going to be any, we're not recording until next week, so what kind of polling can we use or discuss to preview the debates? And so there was a couple polls about how interested and engaged Democratic primary voters are. About 2/3, according to an AP NORC poll, of Democratic primary voters say they're not really paying attention yet. They don't really know much about where the candidate stands. There was a Monmouth poll that was interesting that you had over half say they were almost certain to watch it live, but like a quarter, I think, said that they were excited about watching it, so they were going to watch it, with some other kind of attitude, I guess, or begrudgingly watch it, which was interesting. And then we always wrap the show with something kind of ridiculous, like we don't with I don't want to say a garbage poll, but like a poll that just some,
No, they're usually garbage polls.
There's just some, somebody wanted to just... No, not even worse.
It's a joke.
Even worse than that. So, somebody making like a kind of nonsense poll that would be funny. And so, when there's like an age thing, then we're particularly interested, since Kristen is the expert on the youngs. And so this one was the young people, a YouGov poll that showed 40% of young people don't use deodorant, which we thought was hilarious.
Well, and so back to the
we talked about, I think, maybe a little bit too long in hindsight.
To connect that back to the overall topic of this panel, being someone who is a member of the millennial generation myself, we take a lot of I think, rhetorical abuse out there in the public. You can find headlines that say millennials are killing Hollywood, millennials are killing cable TV,
Movie theaters, bar
millennials
soap.
drinking, napkins,
avocados.
everything. Millennials are killing.
Weddings.
We are mass murderers. We are killing everything. And something that I find to be really a valuable lesson that I try to convey to a lot of my clients whenever I sort of give talks to people about the generation is that you should have hope. That sometimes, a lot of times, these headlines really get oversold. That again, that millennials are all monolithic, and that wow, millennials really want snacks and a good, attractive office environment. Well, guess what? I think everybody likes snacks and an office that's going to attract.
And oat milk. Oat
Mary
milk is very
Williamson,
important.
no snacks for her. She has no comfort food.
So a great term for this, there's a book out, The Remix, about leading millennials. This is by Lindsay Pollock, an expert on millennials, who in her book thanks my sister, Kathy Erickson, for her research and writing. But she has a great term, generational shaming. So Margie, why does everybody hate millennials?
I mean, I don't think they do. I mean, look, I think
Yes,
there's
they do.
always something, first, it's like an easy joke for people to make. And also, I think people, are feeling like there's something new that they don't understand. And so when they, so that I think that's what people are responding to. But ultimately, we should not think of millennials as monolithic. We should not think of millennials as folks who come to work and demand to get gold stars for participation as sort of another theme, right? When there are so many millennials who are working incredibly hard, who went to college with the promise of of a better life, and have debt for a long time and feel that they are graduating in a job market that's not really what they expected, or forced to take care of elderly parents, or or have children and get married, all kinds of things besides sort of like the hipster meme of what a millennial looks like that obviously exists but is not all of them.
Yeah, I remember the New York Times Magazine did a cover story about an article about what happens when millennials run the workplace. And it starts off with this anecdote about a young man who's working at a company called Mike.com, which is a sort of millennial-focused publishing platform online. And it talks about this young man who tells his boss, I had a friend who just passed away. This has really hit me hard. I need to go to the funeral. I need to take the week off. I'm so sorry. And the boss says, oh, okay, go, be emotionally better and come back to work. And then a couple days later, they find out that this employee had been lying. He had just wanted to go build a treehouse in his backyard. And so lying to his boss so that he could have some me time, and then oversharing on social media. It was like the perfect storm of every bad
And that
millennial
it's a treehouse,
stereotype.
and it's like a regressive play space.
Yeah,
kind of
I
adds
need
to it.
And this is what the New York Times Magazine holds up as when millennials run the workplace. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's not the norm, right?
Do you know what the theme is? Is the New York Times writing some sort of hate click piece that we're all no, that we're outraged by that. That is the theme that actually unites us all.
It's that there's so much attention placed, I think, on people who work in particularly industries like media, tech, and politics, where you're going to over-index for people with certain personality quirks. But the majority of people in the millennial generation are not even going to wind up getting a 4-year college degree. And this is something that I think a lot of people sort of forget. When they think of millennial, they think of the hipster glasses, riding on a hoverboard, demanding free time and safe spaces, wanting everything organic. I'm going to roll into my office at 10 with my iced coffee kind of person. And that is just not actually the norm. That may be somebody who you've encountered in your workplace, but that is not the norm for the millennial generation.
Right, and hope for the millennials. Lindsay Pollock's book, The Remix, points out that Gen Xers were slackers and baby boomers were hippies in the me generation. So everyone comes back. I want to pick up on Kirsten's point about immigration, because that really is a tell about where our politics are going. David Brooks, the official columnist of the Aspen Ideas Festival, recently had a column that said the coming GOP apocalypse. And he said in there, the Republicans have a problem, and that is young adults hate them. And he pointed to the fact that 79% of millennials think immigration is good for America. Kirsten, you're giving advice to the White House, to the RNC. What do they do?
Well, so on an issue like immigration, the first thing you have to realize is that the millennial generation is the second most diverse generation of voters out there, second only to Generation Z, where Generation Z is only half the generation is white non-Hispanic. So anytime you're talking about generational politics, you're inherently also talking sort of racial and ethnic politics because the younger generations are just so much more diverse. So that's piece number one. If you are sort of alienating Latino voters writ large, you are going to have a real uphill battle trying to win younger voter groups. But also, I mean, one thing that's important to point out is that for younger voters, there are certain ways in which they are a bit more sort of isolationist. Let's focus here at home. It would be lovely to be generous to the rest of the world, but we can't. We've got to start home. In a way, Donald Trump's foreign policy is kind of the closest issue where he hits where millennial attitudes are on, like, let's bring the troops home and we shouldn't be off fighting all these wars. But when it comes to being sort of engaged around the world, millennials are very much of the mind that the rest of the world has good things to offer us, that we should be engaging productively and positively with our allies, and that includes countries like Mexico. So rather than saying, let's build a wall, let's engage with them to solve problems. And so I think the kind of combative, racial polarization that we see is just totally out of step with the ability to win over millennials and Gen Z.
I mean, the other thing to remember is a columnist's job is to be provocative and simple in a short, in a short piece, in a short platform. When, as a pollster, my role is to really understand the bigger trends, but also the breadth and depth of people's experiences too. That even if you have something that says 65% say this, well, let's look at the other folks who don't agree with that. Or let's look at the intensity of people who have that opinion. Or let's look at to the extent that this drives their voting decisions, or how worried they truly are, not just how they favor or oppose a specific thing, whether it's immigration or anything else. And that's really how we come to understanding. And that's what makes the internal polling that folks don't always see different than kind of the big picture polling that sometimes folks do see.
And in that sense, is being a podcaster a bit at odds with being a pollster?
It does give you a different sense of what is out there because, and I don't know if folks were at the panel I spoke to last night, where this point I think is really important. We had a really good conversation about media coverage. What public polling outlets do and what they cover, what they include in their polling questions reflects what newsrooms and media outlets want to cover. So you'll see tons of horse race questions. You'll see tons of stuff about electability and all kinds of like cringeworthy framing and questions. You'll see, 1,000, you'll see job approval ratings of Steve Bannon and, Ivanka or whoever's in the news that day, Mitch McConnell and so on. And you won't see, I haven't seen a question on the horrible situations at the border and how we're treating children. I haven't seen a public polling question on that in the last week or two. I haven't seen, we haven't seen a lot of public polling on family separation or some of the, or even on the issues affecting young people about how they feel about how the economy is going to work for them as they get older. I mean, some, but the internal organizational work, campaign polling, organizational work digs a lot deeper into these because you're really trying to figure out the answer. How do you talk about these issues? How do people hear them when you do talk about them in the way that communicates your values? When you're speaking, do people hear you the way you intend? But public polling often will have a lot of the kind of political back and forth that feeds the newsroom and on-air back and forth that is very political in nature, and we miss a lot of that understanding.
Kirsten, an astonishing turn in the story at the border today as you've seen some of the kids sent back to one of those institutions where there were the horrible conditions. What's your instinct about how that issue is going to play or could play?
Well, so one thing that I think when we're talking about sort of the younger voters and how they're looking at these issues, there's a really great book by social scientist Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And it's about the sort of moral foundations that people use to make decisions about what's right, what's wrong, what their political views are. And he finds that there are sort of 5 that they call moral taste buds or moral foundations that help people make these decisions. So it's things like care, fairness, authority, sanctity, and loyalty. And so, for instance, do you believe, like, let's take something like saying the Pledge of Allegiance, kneeling for the anthem. Do you believe that by not kneeling for the anthem, you're doing something disloyal to this country? Does that make you feel angry? To the contrary, if you do kneel to the flag, do you kneel instead of pledging? Does that mean that you hold a position where you don't think that Black Lives Matter? I mean, there's all sorts of different ways that good people, can have very vehement disagreements about what is right and wrong. And what I find in a lot of my research is that for younger voters, care and fairness are the two sort of things that drive them the most. Questions of loyalty, questions of authority, questions of sanctity don't really drive them as much. they're really asking who's being hurt by this. I think that's a big reason why you see young people so vehemently or so adamantly positive about things like legalizing marijuana. The question is, well, who's it hurting, right? Just because it's against the law, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. If it's not hurting me, if it's not hurting anyone else, we should do it. All of which is to say, I think when it comes to the issue of immigration, you find some older voters, especially ones in the Republican Party, who take a kind of authority view of things. And they say, look, people should be following the law. And the consequences of not following the law, they are what they are. But for younger voters with that care and harm sort of thing really activated for them, and that's not to say it's only young voters that see these images and hear these stories and are horrified, but I think especially for younger voters, it's really the kinds of stories that are just sort of continually pushing those buttons that say, this may not be a party for you, and I think is continuing to entrench the GOP's problem with younger voters.
I think one of the big things that happened in the last election cycle in the last couple of years is the incredible movement among young people on guns. I mean, I've been studying guns for a long time. Public opinion actually was leading where politicians were. Public opinion supported stronger gun laws for a very long time. Maybe not every single thing that's been discussed, but a lot. And politicians were, on the Democratic side too, were overly cautious, feeling that there would be a penalty for them, that the polling didn't really seem to suggest that there would be, certainly not to the degree that people felt nervous about it on both sides. Then you had younger people really, after Parkland, really change the political dynamic and force leaders to take notice to younger people in a way that they hadn't before. They hadn't necessarily listened to younger people, and they hadn't listened to where the public was on guns until now. You see a real change where you see it in Democratic primaries. You see it on, you see Republicans, struggling to figure out how to talk about guns. You see them using it less as a negative on Democratic candidates. So it has changed dramatically, even though the underlying structure, which is people want to see guns out of dangerous hands, had been true for a long time.
A fascinating real-world manifestation of the gun issue, and I know a lot of you have kids in school. I was asking some of my younger colleagues at Axios what they would like to hear from Kirsten and Margie, and one of my colleagues on the news desk wrote me an email that said that something was very much on the mind of young people was active shooters in schools. She says, I think the psychological effects of active shooter trainings are a significant new phenomenon for young people. She says, my sister in middle school had a sleepover and they were talking about the strategic advantage of jumping out a window or hiding in a closet. She says it's horrifying to hear, but indicative of just how normalized school shootings have become. What could that do to change? Middle schoolers will probably have a new name for their generation by the time they come along. Do they have a name, by the way?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
So by the time
We could do that.
come along,
That could be one of your ideas.
Sure. So things that happen when you're very young have a very profound effect on your political attitudes over the course of your life. The folks at the Upshot, which is the New York Times sort of data journalism blog, did a project with a data firm called Catalyst, where they did 200,000 interviews with people and looked at their political attitudes over the course of their lifetimes and found that, as I mentioned, people don't necessarily all start off as Democrats and become Republicans. And in fact, the political events that happen when you are between the ages of, I think it was 14 and 20, have 4 times an effect on your lifetime political attitudes as something that happens to you when you're 40. So starting at age 14, I mean, that's when you really begin to try figuring out what your worldview is. So take the millennial generations, for instance. Many of us, the events that shaped our worldview were, for the older millennials, 9/11, the Iraq War, and the financial crisis. And so you can see how that's led to my generation being more kind of skeptical of authority, more sort of fiscally conservative personally. I don't mean in terms of government finances. I mean in terms of not wanting to make, they want to keep their savings in cash when they can save, afraid to put it in risky investments, worried about, they want to buy houses but are worried because they remember what that was like to see that happen. So things that happen that are traumatic during your young adulthood really shape your worldview long term. And something that really breaks my heart for Gen Z and younger is the data about the anxiety levels that for younger people people nowadays, even though by many, many, many metrics, it is a better time to be alive today than it was 50 years ago, you nonetheless see young people feeling a significant degree of anxiety, and it expressing itself in horrifying trends in things like higher suicide rates, especially for young girls, and it's really having negative effects. And I think there are a lot of things that are causing this younger generation to feel this anxiety, but there's no doubt in my mind that it's going to have political consequences down the road.
I think it also, and I say this as both someone who's studied and talked to parents, but as a mom myself and listening to other parents, right, where you grow up not having the experience of active shooter drills, but your kids do, and you get notices from schools saying, just FYI, today we had an active shooter drill, and just wanted to make sure everybody knows. And some kids feel that pressure, some kids don't, but they will have it for years. Meanwhile, for us and probably other folks in this room, just remember seeing black and white videos of people hiding under their desks during air raid drills from years ago. It seems like an ancient memory to me, and now my own children have to have their own active shooter drills. So I miss that kind of thing entirely, but it's something that my children have to face. And I think one of the repercussions of this is it's also led to increased political engagement among moms, like Shannon Watts, who has a new book out, and she's from Colorado, who started part of Everytown, Moms Demand Action, who's really mobilized a lot of moms around the country. And in other ways where you see moms feeling like they have to take political action for their children to help their kids in a way that they feel shut out of the process. The political dialogue is not talking to them or about them, but they have issues that affect them and their families too.
Kirsten, I was fascinated by your point about anxiety. There's been reporting in The Atlantic and elsewhere linking that anxiety to our screens. How much of a factor do you think that
Oh,
is?
it's huge. So think about what it was like to be in high school, whenever you were there. So I was in high school in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it was a great time, but it's also a tough time, right? You're figuring out who you are, you're trying to understand what your identity is, and there are all of these pressures on you. And nowadays, if you are someone in high school or middle school, how popular you are is quantifiable by how many people like your posts on social media. That if you were someone who was facing some kind of social turmoil at school, you could come home and that could still kind of be a safe haven. Now, it follows you everywhere, including on the screens. The pressure to be sort of perfect in all ways, I think, is especially, as I mentioned, for young girls, really, really causing significant harm to many of them in a way that is deeply troubling. So look, there are good things that have come from social media. I am not saying we should all throw the phones away and go back to a time before the iPhone. I think there has been enormous potential unlocked in our society by these technological advances. But we also have to recognize that there's bad that has come with the good. And for young people, they are, I think, in large part as a result of social media, sort of facing things that other generations never had to, pressures that other generations did not have to. And I think one other thing that is interesting, and I don't know to what extent this is caused by screens or if this is just simply the rising political engagement among young people. I mean, as I mentioned, when I first started studying young voters, it was right after Obama was elected, and I was very excited that so many of my peers were getting politically engaged, though as a Republican, I was dismayed that so many of them thought that I was crazy for being a Republican. But I was glad to see more young people getting involved in politics, because it hasn't always been the case. So it's a good thing now if young people can access more political news, be more engaged, find others who support them on issues. But there are also ways that can turn bad. There was a cover story, I believe it was in Esquire a couple of weeks ago, where they did a profile of a young man named Ryan who was a high schooler in Wisconsin and talked about what it was like to sort of go through the day with him in high school. And of course, you've got the pressures of social media, you've got all of those sorts of things. But you also then had him describing how the cliques within his high school were being divided up based on, like, there was the clique of the Bernie bros, and there were, like, the Trump guys with their hats and their trucks and their guns. And, like, can you imagine taking the already kind of divided, cliquish world of high school and then adding into it our sort of hyper-polarized political environment? That sounds like a recipe for disaster. It sounds like a recipe for real problems, I think. So I believe that as we see today's high schoolers age up, we're going to get to see what makes them different than the millennials. And I think it's going to be that they have come of age in a world where social media was the norm for them during high school, and this level of polarization was something that had sort of filtered all the way down to them.
Yeah, well, everybody, is sick of talking to their friends and family about politics on social media. I mean, that's a trend that, transcends all kinds of groups. People have unfriended their family members on Facebook. They don't like talking about it. They feel that it is a place, between feeling anxious about their kids being on phones, and also feeling like when they interact with others on social media, it's fraught with political tension. I think it has a real implication of how people feel about social media and the tech industry more broadly.
So in 2 minutes, we're going to bring you into the conversation. Please just signal. There's a couple microphones around here. And by the way, please be sure to thank the people who volunteer and help with Aspen Ideas Festival, many of them from this beautiful community. So just signal urgently and someone will bring you a microphone. In the meantime, we've talked about immigration. We've talked about the border. We've talked about the guns. Another issue we'll hear a lot about in tomorrow's debate, I expect, is climate. And there's some very fascinating polling of college students. You may be familiar with the work of Cyrus Beschloss, who's the founder and CEO of College Reaction. They just did a poll with 1,052 current students, so it's a good poll. Did it for WBRU, the Brown radio station. And among those college students, most important issue to vote, climate change 31, economy 16, so a massive drop-off. What's going to be the manifestation of climate in 2020?
It's essential to, it's going to be huge in the Democratic Party. I mean, you see, Jay Inslee having some success in his campaign, to the extent anyone can really show success with this field. He's had some success talking about climate change. There was a poll that we talked about today, Sierra Club did with Morning Consult, and it was, it's kind of funny that the response to it, they said, in hindsight, maybe the question should have had a different kind of scale, but it said, how important is the candidate's view on climate change and thinking about how you're going to vote in the primary? This is among Democratic primary voters, not even just among young people. And 100% said very important. I don't think I've ever seen a poll released that wasn't a demographic screening question.
You could ask, is the sky blue? And like 3 people out of 1,000
very
would say,
important. And
not
so,
really.
That's just, there are other ways to ask that question, but it's a sign of how important climate change is. And again, I think similar to guns, but not, identically parallel, where I think you have a lot of younger people saying like, hey, folks who are in charge ahead of us, what are you doing about this problem? This is a problem that seems to affect us a little bit more disproportionately, and so can you please do something about it? And so I think that's part of what we're seeing, in addition to, some of the, habits that form at a young age, and before you get to kind of you get into a habit of not having a sort of an environmental action, but you have a lot of environmental actions at your disposal when you're young. It's kind of a thing, I think there are more ways to kind of incorporate that into young people's daily life. So you add that all together, plus the progressive nature of younger people, and it's not a surprise that younger people find this the most important issue.
I do think that for Republicans, there is an opportunity on this issue, in that when you talk to a lot of young voters about what they feel about it, if you first ask them, well, is the climate changing? Overwhelmingly, they say yes. Is mankind playing a role or driving that change? Overwhelmingly, they say yes. Should we do something about it? Yes. Can we do something about it, and what can we do? And all of a sudden, it gets to be a lot more of a gray area. Well, what would work? Well, what do you think about a carbon tax? Well, we don't know. Well, what do you think about this policy? Well, would you be willing to give up your car? And all of a sudden, the how do we actually get there becomes a little bit less appealing, and there's more of a question mark. And there's less a sense that either party has captured the best answer to that. So I think for Republicans, the fact that for younger voters, when you ask them, do you think that the way you communicate with people has changed a lot over the course of your lifetime? They say yes. Do you think the way that you procure goods and services for yourself has changed a lot over the course of your lifetime? Yes. The technological change has been rapid and enormous and disruptive in so many areas of life. And then you say, has the way you get electricity changed? that much in your lifetime? Has the way you get from point A to point B changed that much in your lifetime? And they'll kind of go, oh, well, I guess not really. That there's a sense that maybe there's not as much innovation happening in that space that they're aware of. Or could we accelerate that more? And I think there are things that Republicans could do that are completely in line with conservative values and Republican views on the role of government to make it easier for limited carbon forms of energy to be able to really get a foothold in the market and to take off. And so instead of saying, hey, you'd have to give up your car, Republicans could have a message that says, we want to leverage the forces that we believe in to innovate our way to lower carbon emissions.
Yeah, I wish Republicans would take that opportunity, but some folks are saying, you know, I mean, because that may be where voters are, and there may be where, you know, a number of Republican voters are. Certainly younger Republican voters are more likely to have those kinds of views. But you hear from a lot of Republican elected officials, this is the greatest hoax. This is a hoax. This is not happening. You know, this is not real. And then it makes it much harder to have these kinds of conversations. You're like, well, this guy said it's not real. So why should I, think about all these other kinds of things? And so, so that to me, it puts us at a real impasse. And when you look at a lot of polling on a variety of issues, you routinely see that the biggest partisan divide is on climate change. And in part, I'm afraid to say, is because the Republican leaders have made it so. I mean, that Republican voters didn't, wake up and say, I'm mad about the idea of climate change. Republican leaders have widened that gap. It didn't exist when I started doing polling. When I first started polling, there wasn't a big party difference on climate change at all.
We're going to go right here in 5 seconds, but Kirsten has a rule that she picked up about questions.
Oh, so you're going to make me the bad guy. I've got to give the rule. Okay, so the Harvard Institute of Politics JFK Junior Forum, they bring speakers in to talk to students there all the time, and it's a policy that all speakers that come to the forum have to get asked questions, but the rule is a question. A meaning singular, and question meaning ending in a question mark. So we were discussing backstage, and we think those are good rules for today.
Okay.
But you made me the bad guy because I had to say
I was
it.
here, I was like, I didn't know about what's the rule. You guys talked about a rule. Nobody told me what it was.
All right, orange microphone.
I was wondering if you could comment on young people's perceptions of religious affiliation with the Republican Party, and particularly I'm thinking on the issue of abortion.
Sure. So I'll answer the latter part of the question first, which is that on the issue of abortion, I think both the generation divides and gender divides are sometimes portrayed as being much bigger than they actually are in the data. It's certainly the case that when it comes to younger voters, things like birth control are relatively uncontroversial. I mean, there are lots of things in sort of the reproductive health arena where younger voters are very much of the mind, why are we even debating this? Why is this political? But there is a significant portion of younger voters, and whether this is because of sonogram technology or what have you, that actually do consider themselves pro-life, not necessarily of the sort of Alabama no exceptions variety, but of the, look, we need to find a good balance between all of the rights involved here. So there's less of, I think, a generation gap on the issue of abortion. There is a big difference in the way young people think about religion. And it's really fascinating. I mean, there's tons of data that younger people are just as likely as their elders to say they pray daily, to say they consider themselves spiritual or people of faith, but they are dramatically less likely to identify formally with a religious affiliation. And you're also seeing declines in religious affiliation among older voters, but for younger voters, that's kind of just the default, is saying, look, I pray daily, maybe I believe in a higher power, but I'm not going to, I'm not sitting in the pew, I'm not calling myself by a certain label. And I think you actually see that aversion to labels manifest itself in a lot of ways with young people. The idea that, like, I may believe a couple things, but I don't want to sign on with your whole ideology, your entire religion, your entire political party. You see a lot of young people saying, I want to be independent because I agree with you, 3 things here and 5 things there. So I think when it comes to religion, to the extent that Republicans are branded as the party of more religious people, I mean, that will obviously be another sort of divide with younger voters. But I don't think necessarily being a party that welcomes people of faith is bad for Republicans or Democrats. It's just sort of recognizing that traditional labels and the way people think about religion is different for younger voters.
We had a number of questions in this zip code right there.
Yes, my question is about climate change. The question is, why is it unclear? I ran into John Kerry, who was speaking at Tattered Cover in Denver, and this was immediately after Trump had left the climate accord. And he was talking very, very clearly about what had been done during the Obama administration and what he personally had done and what could be done within 50 years in terms of addressing climate change. It wasn't vague at all. So why is it confused?
Well, I mean, confusing for who? Confusing among voters, you mean?
Yes.
I mean, my sense is, and you hear whether it's the president or whether it's vocal folks on the right who like to portray. I mean, you've heard this before that conservation is sort of seen as kind of is mocked as its own sort of religion or lifestyle, as opposed to something that's good and that has a purpose in and of itself. You also see key folks in the Trump administration with ties to extraction industry, right? And that's part of this too. It's not simply believe it or don't believe it. There's also, the conflict of interest involved with a lot of folks on the right who are part of the debate. And so, and you hear anecdotally, and you hear in a lot of different states where you have folks who, how do you talk about the resources and jobs in a particular state that is, transitioning from one type of economy to another, or may have other economics, whether it's coal or whether it's, clean energy or natural gas or solar. I mean, you see these conflicts in a variety of different states, and they become political when they don't have to be. I think people take their cues from their leaders, and so there are lots of things. Climate change is one of them, but sometimes views toward the FBI or views toward Vladimir Putin can become partisan all of a sudden if you see, our leaders, try to create new wedges.
We have a high hand in the very back. Excuse me, the microphone is right here, so maybe to the lady in green. Yeah, right there. Thank you.
Lucky me. So there's been an alarming rise in the favorability of socialism among younger voters. And I wonder, do they have the same definition of socialism as older people do?
They do not.
Okay.
I will happily take this question.
Can I just,
yes,
sorry
go ahead,
for the second question mark. And because socialism devastates, socialism
interrupted her.
devastates the very people it purports to help. So why isn't that your definition of caring, why isn't that an argument against socialism for younger voters?
So when it comes to the definition of socialism, the Gallup has actually asked this question. They asked it in 1949, and then they asked it again, I believe, last year, which was, when you hear the word socialism, what do you think it means? And back in 1949, almost half of people gave an answer that was something like, the government owns the means of production, the government runs the economy, something to that effect. And very few said it means, we're all friends or something like that. Nowadays, a significant portion thinks that it means we are social with one another. I'm serious, or that...
Or social issues, or social issues.
Social issues, or doesn't it mean that we just have equality? That they don't think of it as, it means that the government plays sort of the primary role in driving the economy and making decisions. So the definition has changed. And I think for a lot of young people, they also view socialism on a spectrum, right? That it's not a you are or you aren't. It's that, well, I don't want North Korea and Venezuela, but is Denmark socialism? And I think that there's actually this tendency, both on I think, people who are proponents of socialism, as well as on the far right, to define socialism down, to take it away from this, it means the government playing sort of a dominant role in the economy, to say, advocates of socialism will say, well, if you like public schools and roads, you like socialism. And Republicans, I think, make a mistake when they point at Democrats, and everything Democrats do, they go, that's socialism. It defines the term down, and suddenly it becomes kind of meaningless. And suddenly, if we're fighting over, do we like socialism or not, if people haven't agreed on a definition, then what is the debate all about? So what I find is that young people actually are okay with capitalism. They actually think capitalism could be fair, but that in its practice today, they're not crazy for going, well, why is that CEO making 5,000 times as much as I'm making when I'm working 50 hours a week in 2 jobs? It doesn't feel fair to me. If that's what the market is delivering, something seems wrong about that. And it doesn't mean they want the government to seize the means of production, but they'd like to see capitalism delivering on the idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, you can get ahead. And they're not wrong for thinking that there are ways in which that is not the case these days that could use some remedies.
I mean, I think it was it Knocked Up where Seth Rogen said, I don't know what gluten is, I just think it's everything that's bad. And so I think somehow, like, socialism is like become like that, when people don't really have a common understanding. So but Republicans are trying to define the left on it. That doesn't mean that voters are going to all of a sudden say, well, I don't want equal pay, and I don't want, childcare, or I don't want, or a affordable college. Like, just because you're calling it socialism doesn't mean I now hate all those things.
All right, orange microphone, and then we'll grab our friend in the back next.
Okay, so as someone who's definitely classified as the Gen Z, pretty young, what do you think, you talked about what's shaping our views from 14 to 20, so what do you think is going to end up shaping our views? Will it be like, what effect will the Trump era have? What effect will school shootings have? And how will that really affect elections like 20 years down the line when we start to adult?
So I think and I like the use of adult as a verb. I think I want to go back to that Esquire piece I mentioned before about that kind of the political polarization within a high school, where normally, you would think it's like the jocks and the cheerleaders versus the debate kids, and now it's like the Bernie kids versus the Trump kids. Something that I think characterizes millennials is that we were, coming up in the Obama era, it was more of the, let's all find a way to work together, let's compromise, let's try to be pragmatic, let's be kind of center-left. Like, that really defined us. I think for Gen Z, there is the likelihood that there will be much more, like, combative. Like, there is no compromise. You're either with us or you're against us. And the people on the other side are bad people who need to be stopped. And so I think that Gen Z is potentially going to lead to sort of greater polarization because they feel very passionately about things from a very young age and feel that the stakes are very high. And so I think coming of age in the Trump era with all of the polarization and the tension and the division that comes there, there's the potential that Gen Z could turn away from it and say, we don't want any of this, but the little bits and pieces of evidence that we have so far, I don't think suggests that will be the case. I think suggests that Gen Z will bring this kind of combative style of politics along with them as they age.
Yeah, and I hope it's not, feeling kind of, alienated and rejecting politics and government and public life after seeing, a corrupt administration and saying, well, who wants to be part of that?
All right, very back.
I'm going to build on what the last person talked about, and it's a little bit more on Gen Z. It's interesting to me because everyone will talk about the younger voter, and they sort of group them all together. I mean, the younger vote. Yet millennials and Gen Z are so radically different. I mean, different parents who raised them, different events and conditions, yet everyone's like the younger voter. And on top of that, what really concerns me is at least millennials saw a time where people reached across the aisle post 9/11. The young woman who just stood up, I don't even know her, but I guarantee you she's never seen a time where Republicans and Democrats have even tried to work together. She's only seen political polarization. And the one in the middle just said, well, hopefully they'll be into politics. And I'm saying, why would they? They've only seen it. They've got no reason. And yet, including the people up there, aren't even saying, let's go get them. Like, well, we'll wait and see. That's a small group. And what bothers me is you don't hear one candidate acknowledging that we have a generation that's about to vote for the very first time. We have a chance to kind of get them involved, and they're showing signs of civic engagement, but political engagement, I feel like everyone's just sitting back and ignoring, to me, a generation that's got way more potential than even the millennials.
I have good news for you, which is that if you took a look at voter turnout, so actually the last midterms was the first time that Gen Zers could participate. And for Gen X and for the millennials, the very first time people from their generation participated in midterms, less than a quarter actually did. The numbers were abysmal. For Gen Z, it's 30%. So it's not great. That's not gold star numbers, but it's better. It's an increase certainly over the past two generations where they started off. So it's possible that their baseline will simply be higher. That for them, again, I mean, if you've got high schools where people are picking their friends based on political ideology, politics is present in their lives. It is a part of their identities in a way that other generations it may not have been as much at that age. So I actually think that you are very likely to see them engage a lot. I think for us as pollsters, the big question is where will they land on certain issues? And because some of them are not even of the age of 18 yet, we still don't have enough data to analyze with a lot of clarity where they will stand. But I think if you're looking for them to get engaged, I believe the preliminary signs we've seen suggest they are going to be a force to be reckoned with.
And I don't think I sounded flip. I certainly didn't mean to sound flip about like, oh, I hope they're into politics. I feel like ashamed that younger people are coming of age and seeing like a corrupt joke of an administration. That's how I feel. And I'm, if I didn't elaborate on it, it's because we only have a few minutes left.
There's a hand right here for the orange microphone. It's right behind you, sneaking up on you.
Do you have any polling information for young people and how age and experience factors into their potential vote? For example, Buttigieg versus Biden and Sanders.
My favorite question.
I was gonna say, are you even allowed to take this question?
No, I can talk about this question. So, I mean, there's been a lot of public polling about the kinds of candidates that people are looking for, and I haven't seen a lot that suggests to me that younger people are appreciably different than older folks. Maybe there has been some. I haven't seen it. There's been a little bit of breaking out, looking at gender and how folks view, their interest in a woman candidate, how women feel differently than men. I have a problem with a lot of that public polling, and it's hard to ask people about their preferences. Their preferences cannot be sort of teased apart into demographic characteristics when you also have a sense of who they're asking you about. And some of the questions ask you to think about what the broader electorate looks like. They'll say, okay, which would who do you think is the most electable? So then you're asking people about what they think about or the rest of America's biases, which, and that drives news coverage about who's electable. And I don't know if that's really the right way for that conversation to go. There are other questions that ask, what would you prefer? Somebody who agrees with you on the issues or someone who can beat Donald Trump? First of all, who would want to pick somebody who can't beat Donald Trump? And two, as a Democratic primary voter, why would you say, I want the person who can't win? And two, you're also implying by the question that that your choice, that's what your choice is. That clearly your preference can't possibly win. So would you prefer that choice, or would you prefer the person who won? And the desire among Democrats to beat Donald Trump is so strong that we've split sampled this in a question, and this was just among women, but presumably we'd see the same thing among Democratic primary voters overall. Would you prefer, and we split sample, and a candidate who could beat Donald Trump was stronger than a candidate who could win in November, right? That's how strong the beating Donald Trump piece is that that even just winning in November is like, oh, that also sounds good. We just want someone who could beat Donald Trump. So these questions are really fraught. I mean, there was another one, like, should Democrats focus on independence or on the base? And I think we're asking voters in these public questions to be political consultants and to think about the broader electorate. When, remember, I said in the beginning, 2/3 say that they're not really following it very closely. So I don't know if younger people are going to have a different calculation. They're going to be attracted to Buttigieg or they're going to be attracted to Beto. Bernie Sanders did very well with younger people in 2016. They responded to his issue policy and his authenticity, and they thought he was something kind of new they hadn't seen before. So I don't think it's a requirement that the candidate look exactly like that group.
Margie, you're one of the world's living experts on Walmart moms. Who did they vote for in 2016, and who will they vote for in 2020?
I don't know who they'll vote for in 2020, but they were split. They voted a little bit. They voted for Clinton in 2016, but they've been divided overall. I mean, they've been a little bit more left than women as a group, but they've been a swing voter over time. And what was interesting about that project was this was done over the course of several years, bipartisan, is that we live streamed focus groups where this was before everybody was talking about women voters. They should have been talking about women voters all this time, but this was before everybody was talking about women voters. And so we would live stream focus groups of moms talking about the issues that concern them. And they would be in stories where, moms did not appear in a lot of political stories before. So that was new. And I think what was interesting about that is you could hear the beginning of this, candidates talk like children. I wouldn't tolerate this from my third grader. You'd hear that before 16. You definitely heard it in 16.
we're about to get the hook. So real quick, tomorrow night, as we curl up with NBC or MSNBC or Telemundo to watch the first of two back-to-back debates, an insider's guide to what to look for. One of you tweeted, I think it was Kirsten, I wonder if Warren's team is excited that she's clearly top of the heap in her group, or bummed that she's in the less star-studded night because all the other frontrunners are on Thursday night. What is the answer to that? Is she better off or disadvantaged?
So I think in thinking about it, I think it's good for her. And I think part of it is because I think she has actually had, and again, this is if you are looking at 2020 primary polls, which you probably shouldn't be doing in a serious way at this point because it's very early. But she's had, I think, a pretty good couple of weeks as people have said, hey, you know what, we were all over here focused on like Beto live streaming his dentist appointment. She was putting out plans for things. And as a Republican, I don't agree with those plans, but I'm glad that they're there. I'm glad it's substance that can be debated with. So, you know, if her being sort of one of the lone people out of that top, you know, tier or so of people to be on the stage, if that gives her more oxygen to sort of air those things with less of kind of the circus that may unfold the next night, I think that could be favorable.
I'm working with a candidate who will not appear on the debate stage, and he will be doing live town halls, televised town halls in New Hampshire and in Iowa.
And he's Steve Bullock.
Yes. So that's an alternative to being on the debate stage. But we don't know what's going to happen with the debates. 50% say they're going to watch it live. Maybe not enthusiastically, they say, we'll see, but you know, we're going to find out how many people watch them.
What is the likelihood that people gang up on Vice President Biden? Or are they afraid to do that? Like there's a real split, right?
Who's afraid to do that? Is anybody? I'm leaving this to you. You're the expert for the Democrats.
I mean, lots of candidates are trying to find some contrast.
So you think they will gang up on it?
I don't know if they're going to gang up on him. I think they want to, you know, they only have a few minutes to make their voice heard, and it's going to depend on what kind of question they get. And, you know, they're going to want to, you know, will a candidate want their 5 minutes to be a zinger against Joe Biden? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they want their 5 minutes to be something about what they're for.
Yeah, what I was interpreting your question as is, remember with the Republicans back in August of 2015, that first Fox News debate, you had Trump at the center of the stage, Trump in a commanding position in the polls, and a lot of Republicans figuring, well, do I go after him, or is this just a weird thing that's going to go away? And so I don't want to waste my time going after him because this is going to stop.
Not going away.
But I don't think it's viewed as like this, oh, Biden's this temporary thing we can just avoid.
We'd like to thank David and his colleagues at Comcast, Universal, NBC for making this
Thank
possible.
you.
Thank the Aspen Ideas Festival, Kristen Soltis Anderson, and Margie O'Mara. Thank you. That was so fun.